E15 track here at the TSDS. And the first thing I need to do is to congratulate you on your choice of coming to this session, because we have assembled here what I think is surely the finest set of panelists in Buenos Aires. Yeah, well, we've got agreement here anyway. So we've tried to rival the number of people around the table with the number of panelists we have up here. And I'm going to introduce you to every single one of them, because I think it's very important that you know who they are. So starting over here on this side, we have Antoni I never get that right. I practice all night. Estevadeordal of the Inter-American Development Bank. We then have Ralph Carter of FedEx. We have Mariano Bosch of Adecoagro. We have Jacqueline Musiitwa of the Hoya Law Group. Is it Hoya or Hoja? Hoja Law Group. We then have Ambassador Osakwe of Nigeria. We then have Flavio Scorza of Brazil. And finally, we have Virginia Brown from the US Agency for International Development. So thank you all very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and join us. Now, the topic for today is facilitation. But it's more than that. It's about new, better facilitation. So we've called it Facilitation 2.0. And the idea really is, for this session, is very simple. Think there's very broad support for trade facilitation. People see that there are some frictional, often unintended barriers to trade, and there's lots of value to trying to smooth those out. And so the question we want to ask ourselves is, over the past couple of years, a lot of effort has been expended on trying to implement the trade facilitation agreement. And so the question is, what have we learned from that? And could we perhaps apply some of that knowledge to a broader set of issues to facilitate, such as investment and services? So without further ado, we're going to dive straight into that. And maybe, Antoni, I can ask you to start and give us a little bit. You've done some great work with your team looking at what matters for value chains, whether global value chains, regional value chains, and facilitation is very key for that. So what have you learned about what's the value at stake here, sorry.
Thank you very much, Sean. And also thanks for since this is my first session participating in this in the TSDS, thanks to Ricardo for all the collaboration and also the web for putting together some of this work together. Let me just share what I think maybe are the 4 or 5 reasons on why this trade facilitation agenda is so timely and so important right now and in the last 2 years that since the TFA is being implemented multilaterally, but also with some very interesting experience regionally. The first is what you just mentioned, Sean. I think trade facilitation is critical in a time in which we are observing this huge structural transformation in global trade. It's a critical policy at a time when South-South trade is increasing. Just let's remember that today South-South trade represents around 20% of global trade. It was just only 5%, maybe in like 10, 15 years. And when you have a South-South countries trading with institutions a little bit weaker in terms of customs, you need this functioning of facilitation mechanisms very, very well oiled. The global value chain, this is another area in which what we call products today are intensive in customs. They're customs intensive. They cross border many, many times. So the final product, when you arrive in your living room, has gone through many, many times through different customs procedures. That's why you want that these mechanisms work very, very, very well. And also the most kind of recent development is on e-commerce. You know, the amount of small packages that we will see down the road because of these platforms will increase over time. Again, you need this custom facilitation to work very, very well. So I think it's an agenda that speaks very well to the type of structural transformations that we are seeing right now in global trade. The second reason I think why it's important is that in a time that we're thinking about convergence and making the whole architecture of the global system more efficient, when we have so many regional and bilateral trade agreements in place, one of the best ways to make them function in a much more smoother way is to actually through this, to make them more interoperable and more connecting to each other. And one of the best ways to do that is through actually the technology that we have on trade facilitations, whether it's to connecting the single windows, to make more digitalize the type of operational transactions that we have, and so on. So I think it's an extremely important agenda to making the existing current system much more efficient in terms of its working. A third, I think, is extremely important, also an agenda that connects to a very growing agenda in developing countries, and I speak coming from an international financial institution, which is the focus on infrastructure. We cannot develop and we cannot increase our investments on infrastructure development, what we call the hard infrastructure, without thinking that it has to be complemented and sustained through soft infrastructure. So this emphasis that in the financial institutions we are making on infrastructure development has to tie with the developments on trade facilitation issues. And we see this in the examples. I mean, the major example, of course, is the One Belt, One Road from China, but there are many, many other initiatives around the world that link together the hard and the soft. And finally, and very briefly, and I think those are also the two final comments, very important, trade facilitation has to take into account all the new technology, a lot of the emerging technologies that affect trade, whether it's blockchain, whether it's artificial intelligence, and so on, will go through the type of technologies that we have today in terms of trade facilitation, and we have to make sure that we are absorbing all these technologies in the right manner. And the last point, which I think is very telling for where we are doing here in Buenos Aires, which is also a way to maintain the momentum on trade liberalization. When at time it's difficult for whether it's at the multilateral or the regional level to advance the trade liberalization agenda, trade facilitation is a good way to move this agenda forward. I'll leave it like this for now.
Perfect. Thank you, Tony. Ralph, let's turn straight to you. Today's your lucky day. We're going to give you a magic facilitating wand. So what are you going to use that wand to try and facilitate in the area of trade, investment, other services, which would help FedEx and I guess by extension your customers?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sean. Great to be here and great to be back in BA. I actually lived here for a few years back in the early and mid 90s, so it's a nice homecoming for me. Yeah, so FedEx was and still is a big supporter of the trade facilitation agreement. We worked on it for at least 10 years. Because we saw the value to the economy, to trade, to our customers who are trying to move goods around the world. And so we're very excited about the potential economic payoff. We're part of the Global Alliance on Trade Facilitation, which the purpose of that is to help countries step up and take kind of a best practice implementation and to really show them that when they take these steps to improve their procedures at the border, they're really going to have a big payoff in terms of economic impact and trade and investment. And of course, the statistics that are out there already show that the agreement can reduce trade costs by 15%, which helps a lot of countries become more competitive in global value chains. The WEF itself did a study that showed that you've kind of moved up to the baseline on trade facilitation, it could have, globally, it could have 6 times the economic impact that reducing all tariffs would have. So clearly, facilitating trade and investment and services can have real economic payoffs. I would say that the thing that you have to look out for and be cognizant of is that these changes are not like a tariff where you simply flip a switch and goods come in, or you simply say, okay, now we open up XYZ economy or sector and investment will flow in. These are more behaviors, and they are harder to implement and harder to change. And so it takes vigilance on everybody's part to make sure that these changes actually are happening across 160 countries. Because if they don't, we miss the opportunity to get the economic impact. And so that's part of what the Global Alliance does, is try to kind of monitor and help countries actually take advantage of this really unique opportunity we have to upgrade their customs procedures. Again, we won't get the benefits if everybody doesn't step up and take the actions that are laid out on there. So it's a little bit harder to make sure that everybody implements it than with a simple tariff or some of the other market access commitments that we've done over the years. But so the question is, can this be applied to services and investment? I think the answer clearly is yes. We are a company, a transportation company, that operates in 220 countries and territories around the world. And as a transportation company, we are almost always subject to licensing. We have to get a local trucking license or an aviation license or a courier license or a postal license. And in many markets, there simply really is no kind of structure for that. There are no requirements on when they have to respond to you, what information they require. The standards are vague. The criteria is vague. We may apply and never hear from the agency for a year, 2 years, 3 years in some cases. And investors really don't have a lot of recourse in those situations. And so a facilitation agreement, there are two main components of a facilitation agreement. One is transparency. Put all the rules online so that people around the world can see them. What is actually required to either import or to start a company or to invest, whatever it is, put those rules out there so that people can see them in an easy-to-read format. And with the internet, now everybody should be doing that. But you'll be surprised at how few countries do it and how poor the websites are. So there's a lot of opportunity there. The second part of it is more substantive. How do you apply those rules? Do you apply those standards impartially? Do you set time frames for yourself to respond to applicants? All of these things, I would say, the business environment. How are you applying your standards? That's the second kind of level that a trade facilitation agreement would have. And then a third level, which would be much more ambitious, is how easy is it to do business in your country? How many documents do you require to start a company or to file an import license? All of these kinds of doing business things that you see in, for instance, the World Bank Doing Business Index. Could we incorporate some of those things into a trade facilitation agreement? Again, the more ambitious you get, the more challenging it becomes because these things start to look like substantive commitments that countries have to make. But as a business person, these are the things that we would want to see. And I can say that there's a lot of focus on small business these days, right? Well, transparency would help small business more than anything else. As a small business, they don't have teams of lawyers like my company does that can go out and find out what these rules are. So the easier it is for small businesses to understand how to do business overseas, the more likely they're going to do that. So keep in mind that one of the biggest beneficiaries of a facilitation agreement is small business, and I know that's an objective for all of us. So I think I'll leave it there, Sean.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ralph. So, Mariano, over to you. Your business is obviously quite different from Ralph's. I mean, you're more focused in agricultural products, a little bit more focused in this part of the world. Tell us, what would matter for you in terms of, accessing global markets and potentially, expanding to one or two other businesses around here. And, feel free to tell people a little bit about your business so they understand it as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you. First of all, Adecoagro is an SME, so we are a small business. We are a business that we have created here in South America with investors globally. So we have investors from every part of the world. So in the investor side, we feel comfortable that we have access to investors. But then when we create the business that is an agro-industrial company, we are producing different commodities from sugar, ethanol, electricity, renewable energies, soybean, corn, milk, and rice. So
or any other issue, you are able to SMS your problem in, and that is highlighted, and all of those are then later reported to government. And so there is an increase in transparency ultimately. But I think the last point I'll make is that it is still really hard for SMEs that are operating within developing countries to fully realize the benefits of the TFA. And so if anything, I would like to see, kind of moving forward, a materialization of what's happening at the government level, really trickling down. And I think that'll happen more with increased access to information, as well as utilizing technology more efficiently and more creatively.
Perfect. Thanks, Jacqueline. So, Chiedu, turning to you, and thanks for joining. You've been a very important voice in driving forward the idea that there's a lot of value to international cooperation in delivering investment facilitation. So can you share with us maybe how you see that idea progressing over the next couple of years and maybe building on the, I think, very important event you convened in Abuja last month?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think the first three panelists to the right have given the reasons, the logic for why we have to facilitate either trade or investment. Jacqueline has pointed out why this needs to be done in country, the problems of domestic governance and corruption and the hustlers, and bringing in greater transparency and credibility. Now, how is this playing out multilaterally? I don't have to describe the WTO situation, you know what it is, but here we are, we have a coalition that's called the Friends of Investment Facilitation for Development, originated by developing countries led by China and Argentina, Nigeria, and several of us, and we're pushing an FIFD agenda. What's the process? The process is one of gradual consensus building in a tough negotiating environment in the WTO, where there is in part hostage taking of issues, not real hostages, in part sequencing arguments, what should come before the other, DDA before that, or that before the other one, where there are issues regarding, in something, bogies. Is it a developed country agenda? Is it a plot by multinationals? You know, things that are on the border of irrationality, but it's the scenario that we are dealing with. And so you have this group of FIFD, Nigeria is part of it, and we are pushing an investment facilitation agenda for the reasons that you have heard, substantively the following reasons, adding to what they have said. Transparency of regulations, transparency of measures, transparency of administrative procedures. Secondly, reducing red tape. You had the example of licensing, those that are on the table, those that are below the table, elimination of discretion, reduction of red tape. Also, something that has not been talked about, international cooperation in this area, exchange of information, sharing of best practices, and then hopefully, when we have it within the WTO, to look at the relationship between WTO agreements. What is in the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services? That's primarily an investment agreement with what you have in other areas, even in the GATS 4794, services for charges for services rendered, transparency provision. So to look at the relation between agreements. But something else. Work has been done in other international institutions, the OECD, UNCTAD, several others, to bring it all together and to examine this within a structured agenda. And so this is what we're doing in terms of the substance. The process already, I've said, is inclusive. It's an open door, open-ended. Yesterday, it may be of interest for you to know that there was a working breakfast of ministers. There were well over 60 ministers, including Nigeria. And we adopted a joint ministerial statement on investment facilitation that acknowledges a decision on investment facilitation that we would like to see adopted here and coming out of here to give a boost, give a mandate but create a platform for taking this forward. I think the final part of the answer, Sean, to your question is because there is ignorance that underlines some of these issues, which is where I started off. Is this a plot by multinationals? Is this a developed country agenda? There are lots of bogeys. And so part of what we're doing is to build up an outreach process. And this is why the Nigerian president gave approval that we have an Abuja high-level policy and private sector dialogue. And I'm happy to see a dear friend, the vice president of Huawei, who was on the panel there in Abuja with us on the 2nd and 3rd of November in Abuja. We got an Abuja statement out of this, explains to many of our colleagues in ECOWAS and other African countries, and from no African countries on the initiative except Nigeria. Now we have 6 African countries that have joined the investment facilitation initiative. So going forward, we'd like to do Abuja type outreach. I'm hoping that we can work with you, Ricardo and his team, and you at the World Economic Forum. We've telegraphed this to you already, and to use for this to be able to advertise it and push it forward. The last part of all this is it's in part sentiment, but it's in part agonizingly real. Hundreds of Africans that are dying on the Mediterranean crossing, migratory pressures on Europe, but also population pressures on lots of African countries. You take Nigeria, the population today is 190 million. In 2050, not UN Population Department estimates, but IMF estimates, there will be 450 million Nigerians in 2050. 2 million Nigerians are coming into the job market annually. IMF estimates that you need between 18 to 20 million jobs created if we're to deal with the job pressures on the continent. Not to do this, not to be aggressive and proactive and almost insanely committed to this would be doubly tragic. And so this is what we're doing. Process, substance, business reasons, social reasons, governance reasons, multilateral cooperation reasons.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I think we will come back to some of the politics of this in a minute. But first, if we can go to you. Obviously, I think part of your job is actually making sure that some of these facilitation actions are put in practice in Brazil. So, you know, fine ideas, but how do you make it work in reality? What are some of the challenges?
Well, that is actually my full job. And well, the most important thing that we figured, and also the toughest thing that we figured when implementing trade facilitation in Brazil, it's actually the mindsets of people. That has been the most challenging aspect. When we look at our situation, and I'm certain that other countries share the same particularities or similar situations, we come from a background of a relative closeness to trade. And governmental agencies come from a background of looking into trade, looking into imports as a risk themselves to their operation. Of course, things have changed. Of course, our policies now are different, but all of our institutional framework regarding trade-related controls are based on these premises. So from this one bad seed, we cannot get the sweetest fruits that we could from a different framework. So looking into this situation, our job or mission is to try to change this institutional framework. And then here I'm talking institutional in the sense that the institutional economics talk about institutions. I'm talking about institutions as the rule of the game. The rule sets, the rules governing and creating incentives for people to operate in trade in Brazil are quite ineffective and based a lot on distrust. Distrust from the part of governmental agencies about the importers' behavior, and on the other hand, sometimes, of course, distrust from the traders regarding the functions and the performance of the government. So our big mission is to try to shift this, to try to build something new. And to do this, we have to work in cooperation with the private sector. We have to work in close cooperation with traders. We have to come from a new basis. We have to work together in developing this new institutional framework, and that's what we've been doing. We are implementing a new trade window, a new international trade single window. This single window has been based on process reengineering being performed with the private sector. So we got together at the table through private regulation, and we go into the systems, try to employ the best technology available. And from this basis, we also reach the different governmental agencies. We're now counting with the aid. We will probably be counting with the aid of the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. We are in preliminary negotiations to help us to bring this new risk management culture to the different governmental agencies beside customs.
Perfect. Thank you, Flavio. Now, we saved the best till last. I say this deliberately because I want to create a sense of competition among the panel, because the next thing is I'm going to ask them to try and not critique, but maybe comment on some of the observations some of the others have made. But Virginia, so I think you came from a career in customs, and now you've created and driven some of the most important initiatives to actually drive trade facilitation around the world. Can you tell us a little bit what you've learned from some of that, and maybe what some of the lessons might be for any attempts to do anything similar in the investment or services side, or how they might be expanded? Up to you.
Sure. Thanks, Sean. And thank you to WEF, to ICTSD for inviting me to share my experience. I really appreciate it. Yes, I've seen it actually from the customs side, the USTR side in the United States as a negotiator for trade facilitation, and now have the pleasure of being at USAID, where we're really focusing on the implementation efforts. So I'm going to pick up on a few of the comments that several of the panelists made. But 2 years ago in Nairobi, we launched the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, which you were kind enough to reference. And we are making some initial conversations in Brazil to work with them. But I think one thing that Ralph said that I think is really important is, and because I was thinking back on this on 2 years, is you can't flip a switch. Behavior change takes time. I think many of us with the Alliance thought we would really be just going gangbusters by MC11. And we have made a lot of progress, don't get me wrong, but I want to talk about some of the things along the way in the past couple years that we have really had to confront using a new model, and that's a public-private partnership model to implement the TFA. First, for us at AID, Sean alluded to the fact this was our idea, so we set out to convince other donors to join us with this, as well as the private sector. And I think I have to say that selling the private sector on this idea was a challenge. Why was it a challenge? Partially because we have other models in the development world and the assistance world of public-private partnerships, but those tend to be around health issues, for example, issues that really resonate on the corporate social responsibility side of businesses. In this case, implementation of the TFA resonates on the business side. But those are the folks that actually don't have the time to sit down and work with assistance and development people. So right there, that was a challenge just to get time and effort from them, and then to convince them to dedicate resources, which in many cases with the Alliance are their own in-kind resources. The folks that are responsible for moving goods across the borders every day are now having to commit part of their time to helping on these implementation efforts, which in the government world we sometimes call other duties as assigned. So it's really an additional duty for them. So that was a tough sell to get companies to commit those kinds of resources to the Alliance. And we've had a couple companies that have even seconded people to the Alliance, and so we consider that a success. And the other thing I wanted to pick up on was this whole idea of the two sides of implementation. It's been alluded to by Jacqueline and others. And that's with the government setting the rules and then the private sector having to comply. What we found really from the beginning of our assistance efforts is there really fundamentally is a lack of public-private dialogue in the countries in which we're working. And this was shown in our needs assessments from the beginning. The WTO did 2 rounds of needs assessment, but just getting the right people to the table to talk about these issues is really a huge challenge. And when a mechanism for public-private dialogue is completely lacking, your first step is you have to set that up. That's a project in and of itself in many cases. So that takes time. But I think we're very successful in our model, which is using the International Chamber of Commerce, the WEF's convening power, and CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise, are our 3 partners to bring businesses to the table to have the discussions with government. So that would be a big lesson learned as we're looking forward to any new agreements and new facilitation of implementation efforts. I think the other thing, and we were talking about this just as we sat down, TFA involves multiple agencies. Many people think of just customs with the TFA, but it's not. If you go to any of the agriculture discussions here, you have agriculture, and other licensing entities that are involved. And in the case of the TFA, and I think we need to remember this going forward, for most governments, it was only the trade ministry and for some customs that were actually at the table in Geneva negotiating this agreement. So many of the agencies now that have to implement this agreement feel somewhat blindsided and not included in the decision-making of what the rules were. So that's been something to overcome as we have gone forward with projects identified by both the public and the private sector in the countries in which we're working, getting all the right players and all the right agencies at the table to identify those projects has been a challenge. I think, again, we're doing a good job. We're working with Procomex and in Brazil. I think the other one thing I'll leave with that, and that's on the government side, not only is it getting the border agencies to the table, but what's imperative from our perspective at USAID, but really to make this work, is that the planning or development ministry is at the table. That was really a mantra for us through the negotiations, kind of pleading, frankly, with governments in Geneva to get their development and planning ministries involved as well. Because on the assistance side, if they're not in these conversations and they're not prioritizing implementation of the agreements, that can be just a critical flaw when you get back home to capital, and now with us trying to convene these dialogues. It's just really important to ensure that the planning ministry and the development ministry is on board and will prioritize implementation as well. I think I'll leave it at that for now. I have a few other things I could add as we talk further.
Great, thank you.
Sure. I'll comment on Mr. Osakwe and give some compliments to Nigeria. As I understand it, Nigeria moved up 24 places in the World Bank Ease of Doing Business report, the 2017 report, and it's in the top 10 of the most improved countries in the world.
Right.
Businesses take notice of that. We look at that and we say something good is going on in that country. That country is making the right decisions and moving in the right direction. I'm sure that you will be rewarded in terms of investment and business and economic growth because of the things you're doing. Bringing that back to a trade facilitation agreement, and our idea, this is the same thing in the TFA, is countries that are moving and doing the right things should be rewarded with capacity building assistance. They ought to go to the front of the line. Groups like the Development Bank should see those countries moving in the right direction and encourage them by giving them the resources to do even more and move faster and farther ahead, and serve as an example for your neighbors in your country, in your region. I would also comment on something that Flavio said, which I think is absolutely important, this idea of the mindset, the shift in mindset. This is what we've been talking about with customs for many years. The traditional mindset of customs is, I am to collect revenue and I am to control what comes into my country, stop bad things from coming in. What we're trying to accomplish is a mind shift that says, no, I want to use my border administration to make my country as globally competitive as possible. I want to make it easy for companies to do business in my country, while at the same time controlling it for fiscal and administrative and other controls, which you can do. Those are two sides of the same coin. You can facilitate trade and investment and at the same time carry out your administrative control function because of the technology we have today. Risk management was mentioned. This is the mind shift that we're after, seeing customs as a way to improve my country's competitiveness. You could apply the same idea to other kind of behind-the-border regulatory agencies. A licensing agency who says, my only job is to make sure that you fill out all of these papers properly and that you complete this licensing application standpoint. How can we help these businesses grow and start up in our countries? And I think that's another mind shift that a trade facilitation agreement can help bring about.
Do you want to bask in that for a moment?
Yeah, a couple of points. First of all, I agree with Ralph completely. It's absolutely necessary that the private sector and the public sector work closely together. And that when there are good results, as you've had with Nigeria in terms of the recent World Bank ease of doing business rankings, that business is sensitive enough to pick it up and advertise it. So that's important. Second point I'd like to make is the point that was made by a colleague from USAID, that the government people, the public sector, must be more cooperative with the private sector. The answer to that is what we did in Abuja. The Abuja model we had, and we thought about this, it wasn't done on a whim. We thought about this deeply. We saw the World Economic Forum. In fact, the new president of the World Economic Forum, in a brand new position, delivered a message to the Abuja Policy Forum. It was a public-private sector dialogue, and business was there. The vice president from Osakwe was there, and about 30 other companies. So you have to bring business and the public sector, not in some sort of rhetorical way, but in reality, and they engage. And part of the reason we scored huge and big in Abuja was that the private sector was able to give the message to representatives of government, and the negotiators who engaged in a lot of hostage taking. We want this because it makes sense. So I agree on that point. And this, I think the Abuja model, and we invited USAID, and you had 2 of your representatives participate, and they made important contributions. The last point is actually a challenge, a positive one, to WEF and to ICTSD. I challenge you positively to initiate and drive a global alliance for investment facilitation. That would be the other side of the coin of the global alliance for trade facilitation. Do it.
Okay, we're going to pass it on to somebody. Tony.
Not to answer the question, just to make a, just I wanted to comment on Virginia's comments, and also Ralph, the complexity of this type of projects, and how to implement these trade facilitation projects. And I'm talking about what the bank has been doing in the last 3-4 years. In a specific example I'm going to give you, in lending to some countries to do a kind of a new or update their single windows. We have done 12 projects in the region for 12 countries. We spent more than almost $300 million. And just to touch on the complexities of this is not a regular project for a development bank as we know traditionally, where we usually work on a single education project. That there's usually a single entity on the other side of the table negotiating something that is going to be implemented completely independently for whatever they do, the neighbors of that particular country. The complexity of this project is that first you have to do at the domestic level, the interagency coordination is massive. We estimate that for any single window project that we finance, there are 15 to 20 agencies involved that have to be coordinated to actually implement the project, not to speak with the public and private sector. But the complexity goes beyond that. If one country implements a single window, let's say Peru, this single window will not be effectively used unless there's some sort of those type of schemes. So this is not the typical, I'm just talking from the point of view of financial institution, a typical country-based development project. It's much more complex than that in the region, solving problems day by day. And that's, I think, it's an important message. And the rest, I think, is what we have in this panel, the coordination among different partners and different agencies working in this type of projects.
Great, thanks. I'm going to come back in 1 minute, but first let's bring in some of the wisdom from the crowd. So if anybody would like to probe a little bit further, raise your hand. One disadvantage of not being on the panel is you only have 30 seconds for comment. So let's get a couple of those. Sir.
Carlos Primo Braga, Fundação Dom Cabral Brasil, IMD, Switzerland. The comment on doing business is very interesting. As former corporate secretary of the World Bank Group, I can tell you this was always not only the best-selling report of the World Bank, but also the most debated one. For each Nigeria that went up, there was a France that would come down, and I can tell you it was tough. But my question to Chiedu is a very simple one. You talked about hostage-taking. So by Wednesday, do you see anything with respect to investment in the ministerial declaration? Will there be a ministerial declaration? And on top of that, if it's not by Wednesday, would you think that we can advance this agenda on a plurilateral format in the WTO, even if the Doha round goes nowhere?
Thank you. Let's get one or two more. Could you give the microphone to the gentleman at the end?
Thank you very much. I'm John, a law professor from the Fudan University, Shanghai, China. Thank you very much, distinguished panelists, provide us a different perspective on the relation of the facilitation between the trade and investment. I would like to give you the Chinese perspective on this issue within the WTO framework, because it seems to me that for the TFA and including the category A, and particular for the developing country, China is also a developing country, and category A includes the commitment is optional for facilitation of the transportation. And I think that's particularly important for the facilitation between the trader and investment, because if you want to provide the facilitation of the transportation, for example, Chinese initiative, One Belt and One Road, and China want to build a so-called intercontinental bridge from China mainland to the Europe, and pass through the Central Asia. And but most Central Asia countries have not committed to provide the facilitation of the transportation because you know that they are different tracks for transportation, railway. And from China to Europe, it had to change it at least 12 for truck, and it cost too much for transportation. And if we have a truck from the China mainland to Europe, will be reduced the cost very much. And but it needs investment. That's the I think as the for Chinese perspective to have the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank to support to develop the facilitation of trade.
Thank you.
And but my question is
very short question.
A very quick question is because I did not heard from the panel to discuss the further on the WTO. Of course, the question also for the Wednesday maybe declaration address the investment issues. But I think now the challenge for WTO, more and more comprehensive RTA includes the investment. But the WTO RTA does not monitor the particular for the investment including the RTA traditionally. So how does the WTO manage this issue between the trade issue and investment? That's a question for all the distinguished panelists. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. We have time for one last comment from the floor, question from the floor, if there are any. No? Great, then we can go straight back to the panelists. Now, I know Jacqueline and Flavio, you wanted to come in, so feel free to say whatever you're going to say. If you want to react to these questions, you do. Otherwise, we'll come and other people will answer them. Jacqueline.
Okay. I think I wanted to speak briefly about World Bank doing business ranking. As someone who has worked with different countries on helping improving them, I look at it as a kind of double-edged sword because we need to be cautious of countries simply doing a checklist and getting the laws in place and not fully actually implementing them and or complying with them once they are in place. And so I think it's important to start with having good laws, but I think it's also important to make sure that we ensure that there is a culture of compliance rather than a culture of checking off a checklist. I think also what I wanted to say, with respect for the need for dialogue across agencies, I think it's really important for that push to start domestically before foreign or other parties come in. And my experience is that when working with interagencies, it's important if the mandate comes from the highest level of government, the President's office, Prime Minister's office, whatever is relevant in that particular country, to really start the dialogue. Otherwise, sometimes it does get stuck between interministerial battles. The last thing is really to say, I think there's a need as we talk about trade and investment to keep on reiterating the need to focus on inclusion, because I think sometimes it gets lost within the mix, but I do think whether we're focusing on SDGs or individual countries' development goals and their development agendas, it's really important to make sure that we do highlight those and we do, as we talk about investment, really understand some of the challenges that SMEs face, because ultimately they form the largest portion of the private sector of most developing countries.
Well, I'd like to comment on a couple of things that Jacqueline mentioned. First, regarding SMEs and their difficulties getting the benefits from the agreement on trade facilitation. Part of it, I think, is that because the agreement on trade facilitation was not written with SMEs in mind. The agreement regards mostly, not to diminish the great importance of the agreement, but is an agreement for business model of 10, 20 years ago. So it does not regard the developments of e-commerce as it could, and how e-commerce maybe could help SMEs to be more inserted into international trade. Another very important point that you made, and that you've just made, it's about the interagency dialogue and how you need a mandate to do that. One of, I think, the most important measures provided in the TFA, it's sort of hidden in the end, is the National Committee on Trade Facilitation. So the agreement mentions talks just a little bit about this issue, just mentions that every country should have a national committee to implement the things in the agreement, but the national committee can do so much more than that. It can be a very, very important forum, not only to coordinate the many different agencies, but also a forum for the dialogue with the private sector. And that's also something that we are implementing now in Brazil, very much based on the experience developing cooperating with the private sector on the development of the single window. This experience should not be restricted to one single project, although a huge project is one single project with a specific time schedule. We should benefit of this dialogue and create an institutional also framework to have this as a permanent thing and to have this also mandated by the presidency and so forth. Also, just to finish this intervention, commenting a bit on Virginia and the Global Alliance efforts, it's very important to bring government and the private sector at the same table to discuss issues, but what we found out is that the discussion can be much more useful, much more interesting if it is structured somehow. So when we've done that in Brazil, we use Kaizen methodologies to have everything, to have the opportunity for people to intervene at the right moment and to really pinpoint what are their bottlenecks from the view, where are the opportunities to improve in very, very specific and sometimes detailed aspects of trade controls.
Great. Thank you. Virginia, you wanted to come in?
Can I just comment back on that really quickly? I'd made a few notes based on a couple things Ralph and Jacqueline had said, but I think just picking up on that, managing expectations in that dialogue, I think is really important. And one thing was going to touch on, but I'll touch on now, is time frames. I mean, you could hear it in Ralph's voice, sort of we know the agencies have their administrative mandate and they want to do it, but I can tell you that our experience in the Global Alliance is business wanted things done yesterday. And in many cases, business can do things like today. And what's identified as quick wins is very different. I mean, we've seen that in the Global Alliance, so I'll leave it at that, but it's certainly, that's a big sort of difference in space to fill.
Thanks. Mariano, I want to bring you in, but I just want to add one additional question, if I may. Ralph mentioned earlier how he and colleagues were very involved for years in the design, if you like, of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, giving their point of view. And we know there's, I think, at least 5 submissions in proposal to the WTO for investment facilitation ideas. How easy or feasible is it for a company like yours, which maybe doesn't have as many fancy lawyers as Ralph around, to actually give input to that, other than what we've done this week is bringing 100 trade ministers to your backyard? But over to you.
No, thank you. I'm really happy to hear all my colleagues being really worried on and finding ways of accelerating these sustainable trade and investment flows. So, of course, we are not involved as an SME on all these discussions, but I'm really happy to hear that they are all really worried us as the SMEs. And I've heard all of you mentioning that this will certainly give room to us to continue developing what we know how to do, is developing these sustainable production models around the interior of these countries. I had the opportunity also to visit many other countries of the world, like Nigeria and different places, and I can also see the difficulties on infrastructure, education, many other things, even a lot more challenging than what we have here in South America. Here we have an environment that is easier than others, and not easier than some others, but we are in the medium, I would say. So my reaction to what I heard from my colleague panelists is being happy to see many people worrying about this, and that they will, I'm pretty sure they will take care of this happen, and this will certainly allow us to take advantage of having a more transparent market. That is what we need.
Great, thank you. Now, Chiedu, I think maybe there was a fairly specific question for you about the possibilities within plurilaterals or other mechanisms to drive forward some of these ideas. Your thoughts?
I'm surprised that he did not introduce eminently Carlos Braga, who used to be the World Bank representative to the WTO, and lots of good things seated right across my former boss, Alejandro O'Hara, the DD. So I have some of my previous masters and colleagues and friends here. No, Carlos's question is a key one. Look, there's a blowback against globalization across the world. And so we are dealing in a different scenario, vastly different after the 23rd of July 2016. It's a hugely different situation. Even for those who are masters of the universe and had lots of experience with this, it's very different. And so what needs to happen, in my view, is, I know he used the word, Carlos, my friend, used the word plurilaterals, but I would prefer to use the word just coalitions. What a beauty of what's going on in the FIFID group is that FIFID, Friends of Investment Facilitation for Development, is FIFD, is that this actually, in my view, is a classic example of the way the WTO as a member-driven organization is supposed to work. You want it, members, you drive it. And so it's not going to be a secretary-driven thing. Gather momentum over time, and then you see how it goes. This actually is the way it's supposed to work in a member-driven organization. Final point in this answer to Carlos, something that we did not expect. The presidential statement by the Mercosur group yesterday was one of the finest examples I've seen about how the new multilateralism would work. The regions that benefit, you had 4 or 5 presidents from this region who sat on the podium yesterday at the convention center and put their money where their mouths were. You had a televised, you had a video message from the president of Chile. I think this is how it's going to come together to work post 23rd July 2016. And then gradually you build it up. It's different. It's different from the days of the Quad. United States, Canada, Japan, and European Union. It's a whole different environment. And this is, I think, Virginia's point and Flavio's point. Governments will not always be in lockstep with the private sector. Because the private sector, I mean, you're more efficient, you do balance sheet, you press the levers on the machines and the nickels and dimes drop at the end of the day and you see what it's like on the balance sheet. But with governments, it's a slower process. It's not in lockstep. And so we need to find a way to work together. And we think that the model we set up in Abuja helps. And then Carlos will keep building coalitions. And eventually it would work one way or the other.
Great. Well, time goes quickly when you're having fun, so we're soon going to have to start wrapping up. So I think maybe what I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do is, have a couple of final reflections points that you wanted to make, but particularly maybe to focus on what would you suggest as some concrete steps we can take jointly, I mean, those of us in this room, to try and advance some of these things which obviously seem worth trying to advance. So if it works for you, maybe we'll go back the other way. Virginia, that doesn't mean you have a lot of time to think, but are you ready to jump straight in?
Well, I think from the assistance point of view, I think it's for the public sector and the private sector to really kind of have a realistic discussion and expectation of how quickly capacity can be built. On the private sector, I think, needs to get to be more forthcoming on their ability to comply, or their willingness to comply, I should say. Their willingness to comply, and that they understand that compliance is a key part of this partnership. That and they'll engage in the dialogue so that the rules are rules that they can comply with. And I think that's what I would say, and just what I said a little bit earlier. And then getting agreement on realistic timeframes that will work on both sides, for both the rulemaking side of it, the regulatory side, and companies' ability to comply in a cost-effective way. That those timeframes have to be agreed mutually between the two sides.
Well, just following Virginia here, one thing that I believe that there's no such a thing as the private sector. So there are many different, maybe sometimes conflicting interests, and about the same thing, but maybe at a smaller level of the government. So there is not a single unity, unfortunately, also at the governmental level. So I think that the bigger effort here and in every country is to try to create a framework with the adequate support from both sides to get people talking, to get people working together on developing trade facilitation on every country. And also regarding SMEs, I think it's time to tackle this particular issue. Once we've finished the trade facilitation agreement, we have now to look at more modern business model and how these modern business models can support the development of SMEs, their integration into trade, and maybe there is now a new frontier for trade facilitation in this aspect.
Chiedu?
Point number one, in my view, in concluding, is defending and sustaining a global public good like the WTO can no longer be done the way it was done historically and classically. You need political leadership and engagement. And I think that what we saw from the Mercosur presidency yesterday was a superb example of how to sustain public goods like the WTO. If it means that much to you, and the WTO does certainly mean that, engage at a very high level is one. Second, penultimate point is there's a wonderful piece by Richard Hess. It's close to 5 years back, and the title of the piece was A Messy Multilateralism. I don't know how people have actually their notion of multilateralism. It's never been ideal and typical. Multilateralism has always been messy. And I spent 20 years of my life as an international civil servant. It's not the way people conceive it. If you want it, you have to build coalitions to get it done. There is no sort of hand down from Moses on a tablet of stone of a multilateral set of rules. It's actually never worked that way. What we see now is how it's actually always been. It's been messy. To use, it's not my words, a Richard Hess word, but it describes better the world of international cooperation in which we're living. Final point, and it's one sentence. If we want investment facilitation, and we should, we must, but for commercial reasons and also for public sector reasons, build a global alliance. My hobby horse on investment facilitation.
Jacqueline.
I think my points are really simple. I think moving forward, I'd like to reiterate skills development and skills building over time. We need to realize that it will be an ongoing challenge, especially in LDCs. I think second to that is we need to explore new ways of really implementing for countries that have already signed on to the TFA. And I do think that there is a particular opportunity to explore technology, especially within the RegTech space. Lastly is that of wider partnerships. I've spoken about SMEs, and I do think that if we are looking especially at the developing world, that is the core of where business is. So we do need to find a way of better incorporating their voices, understanding their challenges to really help drive the policy level changes we're seeking to drive. Thanks.
I would like to see a much more open market on the agricultural products. I think that there are a lot of reasons or excuses not to have it, and I think that we haven't gone through the detailed or the understanding of the agronomic things that happen in each one of these agricultural products. And so that's what we would like to see more open and free.
I guess what I would say is that, and I don't know how to do this, but we need to somehow break the Geneva negotiation paradigm. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Last year we went to Geneva and UNCTAD had a conference on e-commerce. It was the third year they'd had it. The first year they had something like 64 people came. The next year they had maybe 164 people came, or 300 people. This year they had 1,000 people come to a conference on e-commerce. You had 1,000 people essentially saying what a good thing e-commerce was, what an opportunity it is for developing countries. This is an UNCTAD conference. These are developing countries saying how important e-commerce is to them and to their economic interests. But then you take the short walk down the hill to the WTO building, and the negotiators sit around the table, and they say, no, I can't do e-commerce until I get all these other things that I've been waiting for so long. And it breaks down. The point is, if it's in your interests, and you know it's in your interests, just do it. And the things that you've been worrying about for so long won't be that important anymore, because you will be growing in other ways, because you'll take advantage of the fantastic opportunities that the digital economy is providing to you. So somehow we have to break this paradigm of saying, I'm not going to do something in my interest unless I get paid for it. And until we break that, it's going to be difficult to move forward in Geneva.
Thanks, Sean. Just maybe I'll finish the minute with something very, very specific and reacting a little bit to the comment by the gentleman from Shanghai when he linked the issue of infrastructure with trade facilitation. We talk a lot about kind of the soft side. I go back to one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning. Infrastructure deficits are huge, not only domestically, but also transnational infrastructure, huge deficits. And the point I want to make here that one of the best investments to get the best returns on this investment is to invest in a very specific class of projects that are very difficult to do, but which is the border project. This is an area in which we are focusing a lot at the bank. It's extremely difficult to put together two countries and to agree to actually do the joint project. This goes back to what the European Union did with Eastern European. I think the One Belt, One Road is something like that. So I just want to make sure that there's a class of projects from the from a development agency perspective that are particularly important for get the right returns on these massive infrastructure transnational investments that we need. And this is the connection between the two agendas, I think.
Perfect, thank you. So just a couple of concluding points. There was a fair amount of mention of the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. So that is a tremendous responsibility, which I think we have in the forum together with our partners to try and deliver. There was a gentleman sitting there who is the director of it, Philippe Isler, but I think he got scared off by the Alliance for Investment Facilitation. So he's run away, but he's wearing a horrible yellow tie, so he's very easy to identify. So whilst we have the responsibility of trying to deliver that, we do also recognize this issue that there are a set of other topics which are also very important to deliver. And so we are very keen to try and help those of you who are advancing that agenda.